All right, what's good, y'all? Let's see. Okay. Hope everybody is well. Welcome back to the Onyx Report, where we as Black male justice advocates uplift Black men and boys using critical analysis. All right. Good evening to everybody coming through. Let's see. Shout out to Metacog. What's up? AB. What's good, AB? Lewis. What's going on, Lewis? We got Trash in here. Black Toxic Masculinist. What's up, Ron? D. Scott. What's good? Good brother Malika. What's happening, man? Ahmed. LXST. What's up? Ghetto user in the house. What's going on? Got Inner Light Radio in the house. What's up? I am broadcasting on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitch, X, and of course, I am always on Inner Light Radio. I'm not sure if I'm on at the exact moment, but I will be soon if I'm not. Shout out to BGS. What's up? Dead Set. Coolest voice on YouTube. What's going on with you, man? We got Woo in here. OX Hermes. Let's see. Harvest. Let's see. Marcus. What's up? Project Pain. Appreciate that. Got Marty in here. What's up? KJ Eternal. DJ Drama. What's up? Paul. Art of Idmore. What's up? Yeah. Number of brothers coming through. Good to see y'all, man. Appreciate you coming through. Let's get the preliminaries, the housekeeping out of the way. You know what it is. This is what we do, right? It's all about using critical analysis to uplift Black men and boys. It is what it is. There we go. And you know what the deal is. Support the show, right? We got the Patreon. We got the Cash App. Got the PayPal, the Venmo. Of course, you can also become a member of the channel. You know what I'm saying? You can also do so on Patreon. You can become a patron of the channel as well and support the Institute for Black Male Studies. So you can do both by becoming a patron, and there are various levels there. The $10 level on the Patreon will also get you the live shows where we're reviewing films. And so you can come in, you can watch the films, dialogue with us about breaking it down, and then, of course, watch past recordings. So, yeah, consider participating on each level, and going from there. All right. This is the various membership levels on YouTube. So go ahead and check that out as well. Support, hit the join button. And of course, hit the subscribe button. So like, share, subscribe, join, and donate. Support the channel. Lastly, make sure you go ahead and pick up the book. Came out last August, Solutions for Anti-Black Misandry. Go ahead and pick that up. You can buy it on Amazon. You can get it pretty much anywhere. So just go ahead and put in the search, put in Dr. T. Hasan Johnson, and check out the book on Routledge. So appreciate y'all. And those of you that have already purchased it and supported it, my thanks. It is truly appreciated. So let me see here. So oh man, we got a lot to cover. This is a requested show after the last one we did, asking that we continue to go through Richard Reeves of Boys and Men. So we're definitely going to do that today. There's a couple things I wanted to get at, a number of things actually, before we delve into Reeves himself. And we'll kind of go from there. And if you've read Reeves and have anything you're interested in, please make sure you let me know. Shout out to Ian. I see you coming through. Ian always been supporting the show, putting out the information in the comments. It is much appreciated. Shout out to you, brother. All right. So to kind of get in, I should say, so just a little update. So last week I actually I'm starting to actually get out of the house, which on my sabbatical, I'm highly tempted to not do. I get all turned around, man. I mean, I get disconnected from the outside world. I have literally gotten up, taken a shower, gotten dressed, and thought I'll go to lunch, and I'll walk out because the clock says 2, and it's 2 a.m., not 2 p.m. So I can get completely dislodged from what's going on outside, especially when I'm writing, 18 hours a day. I'm completely disconnected. So I'm getting back into the groove of things. Last week, I went to check comedian Ali Sadiq. He came to LA, did an incredible performance. If you're not familiar with the brother, he's excellent. He's brilliant. He's probably the best storytelling comedian since Cosby. And one of his seminal pieces to me is a short bit, but he talks about Father's Day. So if you don't know anything about Ali Sadiq, just put in Ali Sadiq Fatherhood or Father's Day, excuse me, and you'll get a good feel for his approach. So I like the brother. I went and checked him out, and tomorrow night I'm going to see Slick Rick. So Slick Rick is actually coming to Fresno, so I'm gonna be up in the house. I don't think I've ever had a chance to see Slick Rick, so I'm trying to get out there and not be confined to this computer so much. I'm working on it. Yeah, Joe, Mexican got on boots. That brother's hilarious, man. Anyway, so shout out to that. And if anybody has any suggestions on some upcoming things I should check out, let me know. I'm also trying to catch up on some of these movies you guys are suggesting. So BGS and I will probably do American Fiction. We'll probably do a live review of that on Patreon. And then I might do a separate review on YouTube. But I've been asked to look at Origin, and I keep forgetting what Origin is. So I'll consider that one. But if you guys have other ones, let me know. All right. So just to kind of kick off tonight, we're going to start with the Sacred Black Masculine series. Y'all know, longtime listeners know, I do this really organically. And it's just about acknowledging Black men who are doing the kind of stuff Black men have always done. Incredible work that often goes unsung. And this one goes to the good brother King. Many of you might be familiar. Shout out to Art Noostel. What's good with you, Noostel? Rainfire, what's up? This one goes to King, the brother. I think he's out in Florida. He's doing work with young Black men. And this is just a clip that I saw or had sent to me on Facebook. And I just wanted to shout him out. This is so just check this out real quick. Let me kind of get this off. Turn the sound up, and here you go.
Take this freaking pad out right here. You see it?
Yes, sir.
See the pad?
Yes, sir.
Now, like I'm telling you, these don't need change. You understand?
Yes, sir.
These are fine. See how thick that is right there?
Yes, sir.
If it needed to be changed, it would be way lower. Like it would be way close down. So you got a lot of thickness right there. That's how much thickness you got right there. You understand?
Yes, sir.
You got plenty of time. But that's how you replace them. You replace it the same way you take it out. You understand?
Yes, sir.
You put it right back in the same exact way. You understand?
Yes, sir.
That's how you gonna do that. You're gonna put that bad boy in just like that. Boom. Your brakes have been replaced. You understand?
Yeah. So shout out to King, right? And I'm a fan of that because mentorship does not have to be all consuming. It doesn't have to be, something crazy. It can simply be just sharing something that you know with those who don't, especially most particularly other young brothers, right? But and I don't even confine it to young because it is what it is. But the fact that he was working, he was sharing, young men were learning. That's all I care about, and I wanted to shout him out for that. That's the kind of work I see brothers do all the time. But again, those aren't the kind of things that we get accolades for. So if what little we can extend to each other, absolutely nothing wrong with. So shout out to the brother, and I hope he continues to do that. And I hope we find new ways to do that with those around us, mentees, sons, stepsons, whatever it is, man. Just make sure you stay on point in terms of giving them some info, giving them more than you had, because I know many of us didn't get a whole lot, and sometimes we did, but pour that back in. You know what I mean? Pay it forward, as they say. So shout out to King doing that work. Another piece I wanted to acknowledge in the Sacred Black Masculine, series is let me see this one here. So let me go ahead and share this. Make sure you guys can see it. There we go. So this is interesting, right? Fulton County, right? Commissioner Natalie Hall sexually discriminated against her former chief of staff, Judge Rules, right? So here you have, I don't see if they have a picture. There you go. That's the brother right there, I believe. And he basically, well, I'll go ahead and read it so you can get a sense of what's going on with it. So this is Atlanta, where all kinds of this kind of shit happens, I guess. Federal judge ruled Friday afternoon that Fulton County Commissioner Natalie Hall did discriminate, SA against her, did sexually discriminate against her former chief of staff. Calvin Brock filed a federal equal employment opportunity complaint against Hall in federal court. Brock accused Hall of tracking his every move by planting 3 recording devices in his vehicles and firing him from his job because he ended the relationship. See, we're starting to get more of these. I'm trying to see if they have, I know they have a picture on here, but I don't want to get copyright hit for playing their video. So that's him. And there she goes, right? So in the judge's 68-page ruling, Fulton County, by way of Commissioner Hall, did discriminate against Brock on the basis of sex after the commissioner and Brock's romantic relationship went sour. The judge ordered the county to award the former chief of staff back pay dating back to September 2020 with interest, attorney's fees, and $65,000 in compensatory damages. In addition to monetary damages, the judge ordered the county to provide supervisory training for Commissioner Hall. The judge also is requiring the county to post the EEOC decision as well as the remedies in work area where employees frequent and post the decision on the county website. There was no jury in the case, so the ruling was handed down by the judge, stemming from arguments heard during an August hearing. Fulton County Board votes to censure commissioner. Last October, the county commission voted to censure Hall for her behavior, and one of her colleagues spoke out about the case then. To have a sexual relationship with a subordinate is a lapse in judgment because now you have to put the body and the taxpayers at risk, District 6 Commissioner Khadija Abdul-Rahman said. Obviously, we do not have the ability to fire one another. That is sort of a different context in the way of public officials, but we do have the ability to express our public disapproval. And that is District 2 Bob Ellis, who led the censure vote 5-1. Right. Let me see if there's anything else in here I want to say. I'll leave it there for now. So the reason I'm going through this and the reason I'm mentioning this in the Sacred Black Masculine aspect of the show is that few of us really, go forward and put things in court. We seldom sue, especially in regard to sexual discrimination, SA, things of that nature. And I think it's led people to believe that it doesn't happen, right? I think people believe it doesn't happen because you don't see brothers going public about it. And I wanted to commend the brother for being willing to do so, because I think we need more of it. Simply to point out that not only do Black men experience sexual discrimination, right? Because I've talked about this for years. It's a mix of race and sex in many ways, especially when it comes to the assumptions about Black men, stereotypes about Black men, even in the workplace. black men being hyper virile, being a sexual threat, being a physical threat, and those kind of things are used against us sometimes in the workplace, and they do often form a kind of composite race sex kind of stereotypical imprint that I think people are so familiar with that they tend to accept that we must be guilty of something even when we're not. So this brother actually went further. He experienced it. He called it out. He took her to court and he won. Right. And I applaud him for doing so, because this is the kind of thing we're going to have to start doing. And it also highlights in many ways, the more we do it, that women are as human as men are. And we've heard for generations that this is, that when men do this, they have an employee that they, deal with sexually or whatever, that they do it. And, it's because they're men. This what? No. We've actually heard about several black women in positions of authority just in the last couple of weeks who've had sexual relationships with subordinates, who've placed boyfriends, side pieces. They themselves have been side pieces, but they put these men in positions of authority. And then, of course, when things blow up, everybody goes crazy, as if women don't do this. So anyway, that said, I wanted to support the brother, and I wanted to acknowledge the example that he's setting. Shout out to Natasha, I think it is, on the Cash App. Appreciate that. I wanted to support the brother's willingness to come forward, because I think that's what we need more of. I think people have a misunderstanding as to what it is black men actually experience in regard to sexual assault, sexual discrimination. And I think it's gonna require us to come forward that much more often. Shout out to Spain Man. Been a member for 17 months. Appreciate the support, good brother. Glad to see you here. Right. So make sure you guys like, share, subscribe, join, and donate. Hit the super chat, as you know, so we can continue to do this kind of work. So anyway, wanted to shout that out real quick. Now that said, a couple of quick public service announcements. So one of the comments in a video I did a couple videos ago, actually, I think it was in my review of Umar Johnson. There was a young woman, or I assume, at least that's what her name suggested, who came in the comments and gave me a kind of high school level Mean Girls kind of analysis of my show and my work. And she compared me to Cynthia G. And she basically said, that I'm the male end of the spectrum, and Cynthia G's the female end, of course, and that we, all of us in between are just out there, and we're crazy, and all that kind of bullshit. She even went into talking about how I look or whatever, and I'm like, this is so childish. But the reason I bring it up is I find it interesting, because I do hear this kind of thing when it comes to being critical of feminism, critical of resources, state, and institutional support for women, and the ignoring of men, most particularly black men and boys. I find when I speak out on these things, I'm considered a monster, right? And what I think was most interesting about her comment is, by putting me on par with Cynthia G, she was saying that both extremes have to be dismissed. And this is a nice, neat little bow that people like to sometimes put me and others like me in as a way of dismissing me. But here's the thing, and this is the question I posed to her. I said, in doing this, you're comparing me to somebody who's actually called for the aborting of black male babies. What exactly have I ever called for that should put me on par with that? See, I think, when you start talking about what people like myself are trying to do in terms of criticizing misandry and structural misandry in society, for me to criticize that versus calling for the aborting of black male babies, where in the world do you actually think those things are even and balanced? Where does that even come from, that you would make that comparison? And I'm only calling her out on this because I've heard it done in different ways. Now, most people don't necessarily mention Cynthia G and say I'm her, but this is the kind of thing that I hear. And I think it's really interesting in and of itself, because I told her what I called for on my channel more than anything is that there should be policy for black males, that black males should be able to function with dignity and be able to interact with society, or if they choose to go elsewhere to have their needs met, they should be able to do so. They should have the freedom to do so without ridicule, and definitely without being attacked, be it physical or canceling, as it were, right? But somehow that's on par with me, it's somehow stating that there needs to be an aborting of, I don't know, black female babies. This is ridiculous. But these kind of false equivalences happen all the time, right? Because you're not supposed to critique certain things. And apparently we've reached a point, a while ago, where any kind of critique, not only of women's behavior in a collective sense, or in an institutional way in terms of what institutions support women and ignore men, somehow calling those things out is tantamount to murdering children. Please stop this bullshit. Hopefully people can engage and use some critical thinking skills. But these are the kind of things that we have happening. So I wanted to kind of, one of the other things she said that I wanted to address is she said that the women I talk about are, represent, such a small strain that she's never even heard of these women. She's never, she says, you bring up women in your show on a regular basis that I've never seen in my real life. And I'm like, so what? I bring up women and document their behavior because it's not that these women don't exist and we don't see them. It's because we've never learned to see women who are acting out of pocket as a problem. Even in media, you'll get news reports about some of the women that I'm about to show you, for example, and it goes in one ear and out the other, if you see it at all. A lot of times it's played, low key on small publications, and we don't see it. So that somehow means that it's not happening. And the reason I try to call attention to these things is because it's happening quite a bit. It just doesn't reach your radar. And even when it does, because you're not acculturated to pondering the impact of it, you consider it irrelevant. I call attention to it because I call attention to stories that directly impact young men and boys. So let's get in men. Let's see an example. So this is coming out of People magazine. This is dated January 23rd, yesterday, right? Teacher who appeared on Good Morning America after viral video admits to sexually abusing minor 20 to 30 times. Now, when I say I'm calling out misandry, what I mean in this instance is how much would it have taken for a man to have been called out publicly? 20 to 30 times, really? We have this one-sided dichotomy about sexuality and aggressiveness and whatnot, that we've learned to distill that down to men bad, women divine. That's where we've gotten to. But the reality is, if you look at the data, even around SA, right, what we often find is that men and women we tend to rely on different methods. I'll be the first to admit, likely due to testosterone, men may appear more aggressive on the surface. Our tactics may be more direct. But what you find when you delve into the data enough is it's not that women are necessarily doing it less, they're doing it differently. And because they're doing it differently and their methods don't come across the way men's do, we have the assumption that women don't do it at all. No, women do it differently, but it doesn't mean they don't do it. And in this instance, we're seeing a teacher, i.e. somebody in a position of authority, who's exploiting somebody beneath her. Ghetto user, appreciate that support. Says, keep up the excellent analysis, Doc. Pay the woman no mind, delusional mindset. Real talk. Real talk. Shout out to Andre, member for 7 months. Appreciate that. Says, I've never seen it in my life, so it doesn't exist. Exactly. This is the kind of, and I think J Block said it best, solipsism of that statement, right? Yep. Shout out to Inner Light. I'm live on the air there as well. So you can check me out on Inner Light, Facebook, LinkedIn, of course, YouTube, Twitch, and Twitter. So thank you for that. But Inner Light is Black owned. So, if you're interested in supporting Black owned businesses, particularly by a good brother that I have a great amount of respect for, Brother Jamal, go ahead and support Inner Light Radio so we can continue to build this up. So, got to support Black male made media, straight up. Anyway, so let me go into this a little bit so y'all can see what I'm talking about here. It says a 33-year-old teacher pled guilty to transporting a minor across state lines for the purpose of unlawful sexual activity. Right? So let me just go through this. In Arkansas, okay. The Arkansas high school teacher who was featured on Good Morning America in 2020 after her students made her a heartwarming video has pled guilty to transporting a minor across state lines for the purpose of unlawful sexual activity. An investigation revealed that 33-year-old Heather Hare had sex with a senior student at Bryant High School in Bryant, Arkansas, according to a press release from the office of Jonathan D. Ross, U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Arkansas. Hare, who taught family consumer science at the school, admitted to having sex with that student, a minor, approximately 20 or 30 times throughout 21-22 school year, per the release. She and the unnamed student had sex multiple times at her home in Conway, Arkansas, as well as in her vehicle, her classroom, and in parking lots at the school. Damn. Hare met the victim on his first day of class and began counseling him in a one-on-one setting, per the release. She later gave him her phone number, Instagram account, and Snapchat account, and after telling him that she had dreamed of them having sex, her home address. Word. Really? During an April 22 class field trip to Washington, D.C., which Hare sponsored and chaperoned, she and the victim engaged in the unlawful sexual activity to which she pled guilty on Monday. This former teacher took advantage of her position of trust and the vulnerability of a minor, using her role to entice and lure this minor into engaging in unlawful sexual activity, Ross said in a statement. Our office will continue to seek significant penalties against any educational professional who sexually abuses their students. All right. Prior to meeting the victim, Hare was featured on Good Morning America after a group of her students made her a heartfelt farewell video after her consumer science course was halted amid distance learning during the pandemic. I immediately started bawling my eyes out, she said. It was fun to see which face would pop up next. According to the press release from federal authorities, Hare was indicted last August and charged with 1 count of transportation of a minor with intent to engage in criminal sexual activity and 1 count of interstate foreign travel for prostitution, sexual activity by coercion. Prosecutors dropped the latter charge in exchange for her guilty plea. She'll be sentenced at a later date, but transportation of a minor to engage in an unlawful sexual activity is punishable by not less than 10 years imprisonment and up to life imprisonment, and not less than 5 years of supervised release. So we'll see if that translates to her getting 6 months of probation. That's what we tend to see when it comes to women in circumstances like this. But we are starting to see it more, and we're starting to see more women catching sentences, because there was a time where I remember people telling me that this is something only men did, right? And it got such that even when I became a teacher, the administrators wouldn't even really supervise the female teachers' behavior, just the males, especially the newly hired ones, but also the veterans. They would just keep a close eye on us. And, because for the most part, as far as they were concerned, women didn't do this. But when I think back to myself being a student from K through 12 all the way through graduate school, amongst the students, yeah, women were doing it. And I've really never known a time when they weren't. But, when it came to the professional discussion around it, you didn't hear as much. So we assumed, or at least a lot of people assume, that it just doesn't happen. And that's one of the reasons why I keep covering these articles, because I want you to see these things never stopped. If anything, the only thing that may have changed is we have more access to information. We have easier access to, the capacity to record things, social media. We're transferring information, personal information in all kinds of ways. And we're starting to discover that more and more women are getting caught with their hand in the cookie jar, as it were. Right. And so the abuse of people beneath them is in question. Now, many will probably say, well, he's probably 17. It shouldn't be a big deal, but it's a big deal when a man does it. You got a 33-year-old male teacher and a 17-year-old girl. See, then you hear people, you can hear the aggression in their voice when they point out how wrong it is. But then when you point it out to a woman, well, a boy is 17. He's practically a man. We shouldn't be doing this. Well, if that's the measure, then the question should be, well, once a girl is capable of having a child, once puberty kicks in, does that mean she's woman enough for a grown man to handle, legally speaking? We usually say no. Why are you flip-flopping it when it comes to men? Young men at that, right? So we got to be consistent. How are we going to do this? Are we going to lower the age of consent, or are we going to hold women as accountable as we do men? Simple question. Not a new one, in fact, but in many ways one that the public has refused to answer, right? So that's one of the things as far as this kind of public service announcement. And in many ways, in response to this question of bringing up obscure women that everyday people never meet. It's not a question of whether or not you meet them. It's a question of whether or not these things are happening and who we're allowed to talk about and who we're not. Those are the questions on the table for me, right? Let's look at another one. How about this one? This is KTLA 5, local news, right? This is dated January 23rd, updated January 23rd as well, 4 minutes after they initially posted it. It says, woman who fatally stabbed man 108 times gets probation and no prison time. I'm gonna let that sink in a little bit. Woman who fatally stabbed man 108 times gets probation, but no prison time. And see, when I talk about women or how institutions, whether it be the news or the judicial component of our government, when there's a difference in treatment, women themselves look at me like, why are you focusing on women? That's ridiculous. You know, why are you're punching down? That's what they say. You're punching down. No, I'm pointing on the institutions that have significant influence over my life and anybody else, designated a citizen and otherwise in this country, right? So it's not women themselves that are the problem. It's the proxy power they have through institutions that leverage on their behalf. That's what I'm pointing to. So here we have a circumstance where you have a woman who has hurt somebody significantly. Let's go through the story a bit. I'll enlarge it. Here we go. Family members of a man stabbed to death by a Ventura County woman during an episode of cannabis-induced psychosis in 2018 are outraged after a judge on Tuesday sentenced the 32-year-old to 2 years of felony probation and no prison time. Let me ask y'all a question. Now, we can, on one level, you can look at this and say, okay, yeah, I've heard that, this synthetic weed that's going around is causing significant problems. A colleague of mine reached out to me about a week or two ago, and she talked about how this very thing impacted her own son, and his behavior changed radically. And, he started doing things he's never done before, and then he got arrested. And so she was telling me that there's this silent epidemic with this synthetic weed. And I could feel her on that. I've known her for years. I've watched her son grow up, so I can understand how she felt, and I can understand the importance of the issue. My question to you all, though, is when it's a young Black male who has been induced by something like synthetic cannabis and stabbed somebody 108 times, what happens to him? Is there empathy extended to him because of the impact of this drug and how it may have adversely affected them, and how they need to, counseling and therapy and, different kinds of resources to help them get back to center? Is that something that happens when it's young Black males or Black males of any age? Shit, this woman is 32. We're not even talking about a 16-year-old girl doing this. This is a 32-year-old woman. Again, a choice. Now, this is, anyway. Well, let's delve into it a little more. See what else we find out. Right? Thousand Oaks resident Brian Spector was convicted of involuntary manslaughter last month in the killing of a 26-year-old accountant. Let me see. On May 27th, 2018, the 32-year-old went to Omelia's apartment, where they both took several hits from the bong filled with marijuana. Spector experienced an adverse reaction from the marijuana and suffered from cannabis-induced psychotic disorder. Or Bryn. I think it's Bryn Spector. I said Brian. Sorry about that. During that psychotic break, she stabbed Omelia multiple times, eventually killing him. She also stabbed herself repeatedly. Shit. This is deep. The next morning, officers arrived at the apartment to find Omelia in a pool of blood and Spector screaming hysterically while still holding a knife in her hands. An officer tried to disarm her. Spector plunged the knife into her neck. Officers used a taser and several baton blows before they were able to finally disarm her. Or I'm assuming Spector is female, but a long serrated bread knife was taken from her hands. Omelia was pronounced dead at the scene. Spector has been out on bail since 2018. It's been 5.5 years where she got to live, with her family, and we get to live with a box of ashes, the victim's brother Shane said. 32-year-old who only had been dating the victim for a few weeks was found to have stabbed him 108 times with 3 different knives. These are things everyone agrees on. Ventura County Deputy District Attorney Audrey Nafziger, I don't know, said that what we don't agree on is that she should have walked free today after doing what she did. She faced up to 4 years in prison along with sentence enhancements through the judge, though the judge ruled that given the facts, he didn't mind or he didn't believe it was warranted. He took into account her lack of criminal record, her professional standing in the community, and that she did, in fact, suffer from severe psychosis at the time, killing, and really did not know what she was doing. Interesting. The judge cited evidence and expert testimony, also saying the 32-year-old did not know marijuana would have this type of effect on her when she smoked with the 26-year-old victim that night. Amelia's family say they also worried about the broader impact of this ruling. I think he set an absolute terrible precedent in the state of California where it's okay to kill somebody after you smoke marijuana, the victim's father, Sean O'Melia, said. Does it set a precedent? I don't know if it does, but it's certainly a case that defense counsels will cite when asking for probation in a case like this. Right? If Spector violates her probation, the judge said she will have to do 4 years of prison time. She was also sentenced to 100 hours of community service. 100 hours of community service. Right. While the 32-year-old nor her family members have returned KTLA's request for comment, she did tearfully address the judge Tuesday. Watch those tears. A whole nother aspect of the gender experience we don't talk about. The power of women's tears, especially white women's tears, right? Tears, they elicit a response, not necessarily from men, but primarily from women. Women and children can use tears to elicit empathy. Men generally can't. It takes a special circumstance for that to happen. Like, for example, if you're a man who has lost a child or a woman, if they've died and they meant a great deal for you and you cry, you may be able to get empathy, but the empathy is in direct relation to who you lost, right? If you're just a man crying because something has gone wrong in your life or whatever, there's not as much empathy kind of extended to you. But if you lost a child or a woman, there's a certain amount. But if a woman or child is the one crying, that's a whole different thing, especially, again, women, right? So these tears can be strategic, but she apparently addressed the judge in tears. She begged for forgiveness and said she'll spend her life doing good for others. Now, look, I'm not one to suggest that synthetic weed can't do this to people. Not at all. I just find it interesting who gets to actually be considered, when it comes to this.
Take this freaking pad out.
Sorry about that. There we go. Right. Who gets to have their experience taken seriously if they said they were in a drug-induced psychosis? And how many black males as young as 14 years old just go to jail? Period. Right. Yeah. Blazak says it. He says synthetic weed spice was killing a lot of people around 2015. Right. Exactly. So these are the kind of things we're looking at. And I raise this because even though these individuals may be fairly obscure, it doesn't change the fact that these things are happening. Last thing I want to raise is something having to do with the Guardian newspaper. It's actually a couple things still that I want to address. Let me get this up. Okay, come on. Go ahead and share this. All right. So this might be an interesting one for you. This is dated today from the Guardian. Roe v. Wade, right? U.S. single people under the age of 50 having less sex since Roe overturned, study finds. Annual study from Match Group of 5,000 single people finds shift in behavior since Supreme Court ruling on abortion. Now, this is not one I'm going to go through with any significant, depth. It's just the subject itself. It's the subject itself. This is why I'm bringing this up. Hold on. Let me put this back up. So why am I bringing this up? One of the things I've been saying on the show for years is that the problem in the Black community and the gender issue as well is a policy issue. And the reason I say it's a policy issue is because policy shapes behavior in societies over generations, but it nonetheless shapes behavior. even in this micro moment, right? Since the overturning of Roe v. Wade, we are seeing a shift in behavior in regard to who's having sex. And I would venture to say the kind of sex people are having, right? Trusting people to have, sex without condoms, things of that nature. Ever since Roe v. Wade was overturned, people are now starting to take other steps. And it seems like abstinence is one of those steps, right? I'm talking more about the impact of policy on behavior than I'm talking about this specific issue. But I'm raising this because when we start calling for policy changes, when we talk about the Black male political agenda, that's the reason we're pushing for new policy, because it has an impact on how people act, on how people behave. When you see these video clips of women beating up boyfriends and husbands and physically assaulting them and attacking them, for example, they're only doing that because policy-wise, they know that, one, if anything happens legally, they're not going to suffer the way men generally do if men do the same thing. But they also know that more often than not, nothing's going to happen to them. That's a policy issue. You start sending women to jail and punishing them the way we punish men for the same crimes, watch how that changes people's behavior, right? Because it's not just the policies themselves, it's the spirit of the policy, how we interpret it as a culture, right? Who we punish and who we don't. I mean, we just saw in one of the first cases I brought up about the teacher and her student, right? And her getting, a couple years of probation. It would be a very different sentence if it was a man. That has to do with the culture of how we interpret policy, right? Because most policies that are gender oriented are written in gender neutral language, believe it or not, meaning that women could actually experience the same kind of sentencing that men do. Often they don't. And a lot of that also has to do not only with judges who are gender biased against men, but also when it comes to juries. This is why the court of public opinion is very dangerous, because it can impact the implementation of law, especially in a judicial environment, a court, right? You leave it up to a jury that comes in with certain, predispositions about what it means to be women, what it means to be men, and how race impacts it as well. This is why so many young Black males who are underage still get sentenced as grown men and sent to grown males institutions, right? Because it has to do with the public interpretation, the cultural perception on certain groups of people. And this is what we're looking at. So I just wanted to kind of point this out because it leads into the next piece I'm going to play for you. Now, this is actually something I was going to play last week, but I didn't. And I hope it doesn't have any music, but we will find out. So this is now this is a clip that came out somewhat in celebration of King's birthday. And it's an overview by a woman of Coretta Scott King. I kind of want to show you a little bit of it. I don't know how long. Let me see how long is this. Do I want to? Oh no, it's about 5 minutes. I'll go through a portion of it. I may stop it here and there, but I don't think I'm gonna play the whole thing. This is kind of a video that came out that somebody made to talk about Coretta, and I want to get at how, in this instance, the groupthink in question is inspired by feminism, Black feminism in particular. But here we go.
Girl, did you know Coretta Scott King had the obey your husband portion of her wedding vows removed when she married Dr. King in 1953? Coretta Scott was born on April 27, 1927 in Hyberger, Alabama. She was an author and civil rights activist. The third of 4 children of Obadiah and Bernice Scott, her father was one of the first Black people in their town to own a vehicle, and he owned a grocery store with his wife, as well as a lumber mill, which was unfortunately burned down along with their home by white people who was mad that they was getting money. Coretta says that they were not necessarily poor, but they did go without, considering this was the Great Depression. She would sometimes pick cotton as a child for extra money. Coretta Scott graduated valedictorian of her class in 1945 and received a scholarship to Antioch College in Yellow Springs, Ohio, majoring in education and music. As a student, she was a member of the NAACP and Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority. Her social activism started early as well, as she challenged a ban on Black teachers in school. She was awarded another scholarship and transferred to the New England Conservatory of Music in Boston, where she would meet her future husband, Martin Luther King Jr., in 1952. Martin was 22 years old, working towards his doctorate and ready for a wife at the assistance of his father, Daddy King. A mutual friend gave Mr. King Coretta's number, but she was not interested. She eventually agreed to meet with him and said she was shocked at how short he was. They courted and bonded over their interest in politics.
Okay, I'm not going to go through this whole damn thing, right? But give me your impressions. What are some of the things you guys picked up in the chat? Let me know what you picked up that you, in terms of this. I think I only played a third of it, a little over a quarter, maybe, right? Okay, let me see. So one of the issues I end up having with this kind of thing is what underlies how she went about it. So let's see. So got Lala saying borderline disrespectful. Okay. Who says, bro, did she really mention his height? No. Now, mind you, this is in celebration, right? This I saw this around on his birthday, right? I think that's what it was. Was it birthday? Or the celebration of King, right? I saw this on that day, right when his son had died. In fact, same day I found out that his son died was the same day I saw this video, right? Here we go. Ryan says Coretta was the prize. Yeah, right. Creative says sounds like Soft Life tunes and Divine Nine accolades. Okay. Let's see. Feminism, but you know what? I got my passport, so I don't care. Right. The short cap. Yep. There we go. Shout out to Dead Set. He says, wow, condescending and dismissive about the man who died giving his life for civil rights for Black people. Now, this is the point. Thank you, Dead Set. Well put. Right? Well put. The spirit in which this video was done was highly influenced by the same type of Black feminism we've been seeing for decades. It was uncalled for, right? It's not the problem in and of itself is that it wasn't that they centered that, or she centered. I don't know what just happened. Anyway, sorry about that. We still broadcasting? Yep, we look good. All right. Damn, that was weird. Anyway, the problem was not that they were centering Coretta. It was unnecessarily disrespectful to present King in that way, right? To downplay him. Girl, did you know they removed this part from the wedding vows about her having to obey? And when she first saw him, she was not interested. He was short. Why is that even necessary? And why is it necessary on the day we celebrate him? And then in turn, on the day his son dies, right? Why is that even necessary? So when I talked earlier about how policy shapes behavior, I've said this in my book, I've said this over the last few years, that when we start to talk about the entitlement that many women have and the entitlement that many Black women have against Black men, right? And the treatment of Black men as something to disdain, right? We talk about that entitlement. It comes out of policy. It comes out of having resources. It comes out of having access on a nominal level in ways that men don't. And men, Black men, have to achieve regardless. Even though we don't have that access, we still have to achieve. And many are reaching that. There are many brothers that are doing their thing, regardless of the fact that ain't nobody handing them anything. But we still have this issue in the Black community of intense disrespect. So here, on the celebration of King 2024, we have videos like this coming out that have to find ways to dismiss and downplay the importance of the man. For what? To try and make Black women feel better about themselves? To historically reframe situations in a contemporary Black feminist language, or at least Black feminist influence language? Why? Is it necessary? Could you build up Coretta without having to do this kind of disrespectful shit? See, this is what I was saying about the color purple. You can have a film that actually big ups women. You can do that. And you don't have to turn to misandry to do that. That's a choice. You can celebrate Black women's achievements without having to denigrate Black men. But those things have become so synonymous in this culture that we've noticed in this last 4 or 5 decades. We can't imagine it being any other way. This 5-minute video celebrating Coretta did not have to disrespect Obama. I mean, Obama. Ooh, God. Only reason I said Obama is I was about to say Obama and bring him up. So I'll bring him up in a second. Didn't have to disrespect King in this way. The reason I was going to say Obama is because we've seen Michelle do similar things when talking about Barack. And it's not necessary. If you want to talk about the difficulties of being married in this contemporary moment and the trials and tribulations of staying in your marriage, that's great. But what president have you ever seen talked about by the first lady in the ways we've seen Michelle talk about Barack? It's very reminiscent of what we just saw in this video in terms of how the discussion was framed around how Coretta felt about Martin. Unnecessary. And it's an unnecessary, disrespectful dig at Black men, even though it's subtle. Now, what am I saying? Well, I'm going back to the person who made her comments about me addressing obscure women. And I want to clarify something. I do talk about women who commit crimes that we generally don't hear about in the news, but I'm also addressing the culture that we come out of, particularly in the Black community, the culture of misandry at that. And that does not just manifest with obscure women who are stabbing people 108 times. Sometimes it comes down to the family members you sit down with every night for dinner, or you meet with on family occasions, Christmas, family reunions, the subtle misandry that's baked into African-American culture. And it's a misandry that many men have grown up with, but we didn't have a language for. We tolerated it, even though we didn't like it, but we did not know how to talk about it. And when we did talk about it, in terms of how Black women talk to Black men, much of the time we were dismissed, right? What I heard in many a session about men and women and relationships was, well, you don't like the way Black women are, but Black women have had to become this out of survival. There's no survival angle to misandry. You didn't choose to disrespect Black men because you needed to survive. You did it because you don't respect Black men. But sometimes it's so subtle. It can happen between married couples, between mothers and sons, grandmothers and grandsons. It's such a subtle thing. But we only seem to understand that, especially in the academy, if you're talking about misogyny. Because feminists can tell you about how misogyny can take place, even amongst people that love each other. But as soon as you bring up misandry, they glaze over. Shout out to Artisan. Appreciate that support, good brother, on the Cash App. Hope you're well. But this is what we have to become more skilled at doing, pulling out these instances of disrespect and calling them on the carpet about it. And I will say, in this last year, one of the reasons I probably haven't broadcasted as much as I used to is I've started to see more brothers speaking out on things that I couldn't imagine them doing a few years ago, right? Even up to this latest case with the brick lady, for example, right? The lady that claimed that she had a man hit her with a brick because she wouldn't give him her phone number. We had all these people on social media jump up and talk about how Black men were, because then she got up and then she claimed that, all these Black men were standing around and didn't help. And immediately people took to social media to talk shit about Black men. And we took it, even though we were calling out some questionable aspects to the story, but a lot of people didn't even require evidence. And then the report came out, and what we found was on video. She was in the car with a gentleman. She hit him, and he hit her back. And apparently he had a water bottle in his hand, right? She got out, then she started to make up this story. I think she lied on at least two fronts. She said it was a brick, which was the first lie. But then she lied by omission and didn't include the fact that she hit him first, which means we're not dealing with a situation of assault or abuse. We're talking about bidirectionality. You started this, you hit him. But see, hitting men has become irrelevant to the point where I didn't hear too many people even entertain whether or not she may have assaulted him first. But many a Black man can tell you that that's not uncommon when dealing with Black women. But somehow it's not part of the conversation. So when Tommy Curry started to talk about bidirectionality and intimate partner violence, most people ignored it. It was only brothers that started to pay attention to it, because we were taught to interpret that violence as just the cost of dealing with women. And that can be psychological violence, emotional violence, or physical violence. We were taught that these things do not really exist when it comes to us. They're only relevant when they come to women. So if you said something she didn't like, that could be emotional abuse. psychological abuse. If you put hands on her in any way, that's physical abuse. And she can levy those charges against you without evidence, especially if you didn't do it, and you still had to pay the freight as if you did. But we still really learned not to interpret it that way when it came to our experience. So now you got brothers like the one I pointed out earlier who sued his employer, right, for sexually discriminating against him. You got men who are starting to recognize it and speaking up about it. And this is important. This is important. And this is why I'm so moved at how many Black men I'm seeing speaking up for different things. Honestly, brought a tear to my eye on a couple points in the last year when I saw different issues pop up that I saw more brothers speaking out on than I ever have in my life. Blew me away. Absolutely blew me away. So shout out to the brothers who are taking this and responding to it. So we got Jerome in here, says your knowledge, Weege, and insight it's priceless and inspiring. Well, I appreciate that. Appreciate it. Right? Yeah. You guys are calling it out. You guys are speaking it up. This was the whole purpose for me around language and why I wanted us to focus on creating our own vocabulary. It's part and parcel to actually starting to see the world in a manner that you can explain that relates to your experience. And when you try to use other people's language to do it, it limits and hampers how you can explain it and what you're trying to explain. There are degrees of clarity that are lost when you're not able to craft your own vocabulary to explain your experiences. And that's one of the things men had to do and still have to do. But I'm so proud of how many brothers I see that can articulate themselves in ways we couldn't 10 years ago. And you can see it impacting what people think and how they even address us. I'm starting to notice that people are becoming a little bit more gun shy when it comes to just arbitrarily dismissing Black men, especially in social media, because now there's a fear of a backlash of men who are going to respond, and they are not taking that shit. Shout out to Andre for the PayPal donation. Appreciate that. Right? I've never seen it before. And so it's kind of giving me pause because I'm trying to decide, if I'm going to take the channel in any different direction or not. But for right now, that's one of those things that gives me pause. When I see a situation come up and I start to see brothers respond to it now, and they're not waiting on, figures on the internet or in social media to lead the way. They're doing it. And I'm reading through comments and I'm seeing, scores of brothers coming in and pushing back against stuff that used to be unchecked. And I'm also seeing Black men starting to respond in the dating marketplace, not just on social media, but in terms of their interactions. When I interact with women, especially on dating apps, and they start telling me stories about the men they've dated in the last couple of years, and sometimes they've never even heard of these spaces, right? And I'm hearing them quote the men that they dated that they weren't able to get with, right? And I'm listening. I'm like, well, that's Kevin Samuel's influence. That's, I'm hearing the influences in women that are quoting men they dated and could not successfully get with. And I'm like, yeah. I had a nationalist reach out to me a couple of years ago, and he was concerned because he was upset that his nephew was starting to make the same kinds of observations, right? So the word is getting out there and it's starting to impact people on the ground level. And I'm seeing men standing up for themselves in ways I've never seen. And I'm proud of it. Proud of it. Let me see. Code Father X. I'm just looking at the comments at random before we jump into Reeves. Says I've even seen possibly the biggest fitness influencer, Joey Swole, speak out against how women are getting out of control in the dating scene. Yeah, I think I have seen that. I think I've tripped up on some of those YouTube videos. I think he talks a lot about women in the gym, right? And how the gym behavior is happening, and how men are supposedly starting to leave gyms because they don't want to be accused of anything by some of these influencers who are using cameras in the gym, and they're half naked and videotaping themselves and then attacking the men who might be working out around them, sometimes falsely so, right? And so men have started to respond by withdrawing from the gym, according to some of these kind of reports. Starting to get proud to see that, but anyway. I ain't even gonna read that, Andre. You know what I mean? Nah. So anyway, man, so let's get to it. So today I wanted to look at a little bit more of this Reeves thing. And it's going to relate to some of the things that I read off because again, we're talking about women's behavior, and we're talking about the behavior that's been shaped by policy in many respects. Now, I can say my issue with Reeves is that at his base, he's a feminist. He's a feminist that's trying to create what I call a politically correct manosphere in professional settings. And so, just when I agree with some of the things he's saying, he'll go left. And at first, it used to piss me off, but then I had to keep reminding myself at his base, he's a feminist. So when he looks at how women are moving in today's society, he doesn't see it as problematic. What he's trying to do is subtly beg women to support the gentle shifting of policy to slightly benefit men because in the long run, it will benefit them. This is how he approaches these issues. The problem with that is one, we've not been socialized to empathize for men on a collective level, and women damn sure haven't. Women have very little empathy for men. They have empathy for their sons, maybe a little bit for their fathers, depending on their relationship with them. But that's about it. So when you start talking about, trying to seduce or lure or convince, cajole women into supporting policy that may benefit men, the only time you're going to get some leeway on that, maybe, is if you talk about sons. And even that's abstract because many women function in terms of what's immediate to their household. So if you're trying to get them to feel something for men and boys, even that can be stymied by whether or not she actually has a boy in her house. Shout out to Electrician 480. Appreciate that support. What's good with you, man? All right. So this is one of the things that impacts us. But I'm going to look at chapter 3. I bounced around. I kind of looked at portions of 2 chapters in the last show. But this time I'm kind of going to roll through a little bit of chapter 3, and I'm trying to skip around the individual stories and kind of get to some of his points. The particular point in the beginning, he starts out by recognizing the rise of Gloria Steinem, one of the first speeches she gave at an early age, and kind of goes from there. He says, for Steinem, as for most feminism of her generation, marriage was a relationship of crippling dependency. Her message to the young women on the lawn at Smith was to make their own way in the world and to be able to pay their own bills. Dependence represents a lack of alternatives, wrote Margaret Mead a few years after Steinem's speech. A woman equipped to earn her own living need never feel trapped. Independence begins with economic independence. And she's basically talking, this is second wave feminism. So she's basically talking about really, white women. And by the time you get to the late 60s, a lot of the movement they had was about middle class white women, right? College degrees, married, but they wanted to make their way into the workforce. And they did. Really what they were calling for was, kind of mid-level white collar employment. And of course, this is something white women were able to achieve. Now, in terms of the coattails of white feminists, it did lift Black women, right? So you had Black women who in many urban cities were working as domestics still in white households. Domestics on one end, and then, you had certain industries that Black women could delve into, like nursing, teaching, but white women were able to kind of pull them more into white collar, low level labor. And of course, they still didn't get paid the way white women did, but it did advance them beyond just servile kinds of positions. So when we talk about these movements in regard to white feminism, they did have an impact on the Black community. And again, not in ways that complemented Black men, right? So let's kind of look more at it. So it says the women's movement is about liberation. That is why it is called Women's Lib. Above all, this meant economic independence. Let's see. For men, the goal has been largely accomplished in advanced economics, turning marriage into a social choice rather than an economic necessity. Until the 1970s, the typical family college graduate had become a wife within a year of graduation. Among today's Smith graduates, only about half are married by their mid-30s. A husband may be nice, but he is no longer necessary. Steinem was right about the importance of breaking the economic chains, but and this is obviously much harder to say, Stevenson was right too. A man who knows he must provide for a wife and children has a clear sense of how to be purposeful and whole. Right? He does a lot of this throughout the book. He tries to apologize for men and the arguments men have made that he really fundamentally agrees with, but finds distasteful from a feminist standpoint. So he leans in and says, "Yes, I'm a feminist. Women need to be supported." And I told you about the politics of citation. He cites a lot of women, and then he kind of subtly says, "Well, yeah, but some of these conservative white men said something. I know they're bad, but they said something that was kind of true." It's very hat in hand, very soft shoe. Please, give something to the men, ladies. Right? Very apologetic. He says, in this chapter, I argue that the role of mothers has been expanded to include breadwinning as well as caring, but the role of fathers has not been expanded to include caring as well as breadwinning. And what he's generally referring to in this chapter is that men, by and large, as fathers and husbands, there was a time period not long ago where we were not socially expected to be emotionally present. That language didn't really exist yet. Right. This is something we talked about, BJS and I, when we did a review of the film Fences with Denzel Washington. Right. That was not a requirement of a father at a certain period. If you remember that famous scene where, his son asks him, "Why don't you like me?" Right. And Troy, who Denzel plays, says, "I don't have to like you. I just have to do my duty to take care of you." And a lot of that, what's misunderstood about men, even men of that era, was that there was a lot of love involved in many instances. But that love was communicated differently, right? Love was communicated through preparing you for the difficulties of life. This is something Black fathers still grapple with to this day, especially in regard to their sons, but also their daughters. How do you prepare your child for the difficulties of being Black? The expectations, the assumptions that people make. Sometimes the fear they have for you simply based on looking at you, right? How do you prepare your child for that against bearing witness to true innocence? If you're a father and you've ever seen your child be born, held your newborn child, watch them grow, watch them learn how to speak, watch them try to lie for the first time, right? There's a challenge that you have as a father about how much of this do I take away? How much of this do I not allow my child to enjoy? Because I know that there's a certain point where the longer I allow him to be innocent, the more unprepared he might be for how difficult shit can get. So, you know what a lot of men did? They tried to make their sons soldiers. That was how they expressed love. I'm going to prepare you for a world I may not always be there to stand next to you and protect you from. I need you to be able to stand on your own. Right? In many ways, this was interpreted as, a lack of feeling, a lack of care. And maybe in certain instances it was, depending on the man you're talking about. But by and large, I don't think that's what we're dealing with. I think we're dealing with fathers who have to continue and have always had to. This is the trial. This is the challenge of Black fatherhood, right? From slavery onward. This is the challenge. To what extent do you take your child's innocence to prepare them for war? And it's not as easy as it sounds. So the decision is not as easy to make. I remember I had these thoughts before I had a child about, what I was going to do to prepare my son. You are not ready to see a 3-year-old look at you and not understand when you start to challenge him in ways that other kids don't get challenged. And I'm not talking physically, it doesn't, but just when you have to prepare him, right? I remember as a child, I had to have been about 3 or 4. In fact, I remember the first time my father set a new standard for how we were going to greet each other. It used to be when I was really little, he'd pick me up and kiss me all over my face. And I was 3, yeah, that's daddy, I remember him telling me, we're not going to do that anymore. We're just going to hug. I didn't understand. I started crying. And he responded differently to my tears. My mother could be rough when she needed to, but my father responded differently. Unmoved. Now, I came to find many years later, this did not mean that my tears didn't impact him, because as a father, there has been many a day I stepped out of the room with my son and damn near shed a tear about what may have just happened, even a tear of joy. Right? I'm not saying it's all bad, but in terms of what I express with my son, I'm very conscious about what that does to him. Doesn't mean I'm always right, but I am strategically conscious about how I am impacting him to the best of my ability. And so I'm like you do with a plant, where you kind of snip and you're trying to shape a plant, you kind of snip at the edges, you let some parts grow, you cut some parts down. You're doing that when you're raising a child. And many a father has had to grapple with that. I want this child to know innocence. I want them to be able to live life, to have fun, to be able to be kids. That's really what we're talking about. But how many of you lost the capacity to be a child long before you became a man by societal standards? How many of you had your childhood sacrificed because the world was harsh and your parents needed you to understand that early? I argue that happens very differently in the Black community than it happens in others. Especially if you're coming from a lack of generational wealth, if you're coming from environments where a lot of people are broke and poor, when you're coming from high competition, areas, maybe even high crime, depending on the circumstances, there is a degree by which, families can't afford a lot of innocence. I remember I was in fourth grade when I started, being at home with just my little sister, when I started taking care of my, so walking to school together, making sure we both made it back, handling household responsibilities. My mother didn't get home till 7, 8 o'clock at night. She worked often 2 jobs as a secretary, right? Never made more than $30,000 in her life. Bless her. Right. They ate a lot of rice-a-roni, and I remember welfare cheese. That's the one that big block that you could technically use to build walls with. I remember that shit. But my responsibility when it came to cooking dinner, when it came to making sure the door was locked and not answering the door for strangers, navigating my sister who was 3 years younger than me, all those responsibilities that come with, in other communities, maybe teenage, late teenage, whatever, fourth grade. And that was late compared to some of my other friends, right? Those are the kind of things that we grapple against. And so in this chapter, when he's talking about fathers and he's saying that, mothers have had the load of breadwinning and caring, and men have just dealt with breadwinning, it's bullshit. But again, if you define caring strictly by women's standards, then yeah, it will appear non-existent, right? Just like with sexual assault and rape, right? The idea that only women do it, only men do it and women don't, that only works as long as the definition of rape is strictly based on how women define it. And that was the case up until 2012. From the advent of the concept in regard to the law, in regard to the FBI's definition of rape, it was defined against a female body. So, of course, 99 to 100% of rapes were going to be committed by men against women. The very definition of the concept only dealt with the violation of a woman and her body, woman's body. Once the definition was opened up, they found they had scores of cases that had nowhere to go because they didn't technically fit the classification. And then we found out that women have all long engaged in their own forms of rape, but they have a different method, right? So then you started to see the development of this concept of made to penetrate, which included women as well, particularly lesbians. And it can involve a foreign object and not just a body, a limb, a sexual organ, right? But overwhelmingly, we started to see that there are ways that women violated men. Once the language changed and we included men, then we found that the differences between men and women were nominal. We just had to pay attention to how men and women operate differently. Well, I argue the same thing is happening with parenting. Now, parenting is very gendered. It's a gendered experience, but it's off the language of how we define parenting has always been defined by women. And that's mainly because feminists in particular have kind of deemed that space women only. Not to say men can't comment on it, but ideologically, you have to do so within a framework that's fundamentally feminist in order to be taken seriously. And the only time you can really talk about fathers is if you're, doing so in kind of a punitive fashion, right? You're dealing with them as problems, right? They fundamentally violate what women are trying to do or women's humanity, so on and so forth. This is what happens. I saw this last night. I was watching True Detective. Now, I've been watching the new fourth season, but I had never watched. I think I watched one season with Mahershala Ali, but I don't remember it. But there's been this big scuttlebutt on YouTube that the current fourth season of True Detective is woke. Because you have the masculine. I guess she's Inuit. I don't know what tribal group she's from. This is filmed in in Alaska, and she's real masculine and whatnot. And so they're saying it's woke. So they say this is, but the first season was the best. So so I went and watched the first season. Actually, what an interesting story. Woody Harrelson, Matthew McConaughey. I mean, to sum it up to you all, because you guys would get the reference far faster than anybody else, it's basically two detectives dealing with a serial killer. One detective is blue pill, the other detective is black. And so just them sitting in the car with one another is, matching gasoline, right? They do not get along by any measure. But the reason I bring it up is there's a particular episode where the blue pill gentleman is sitting there with his family having dinner, and his daughter has begun to act out. She's dressing provocatively. I think she was 16 years old. She's starting to hang out with the goth kids. She's, bullying her little sister. She's starting to become a problem. And the father starts asking her, why do you dress this way? Why do you do what you do? Which I actually thought was brilliant. That was a demonstration of care. He wasn't accosting her. He wasn't arguing with her. He just asked her, why are you dressing this way? What does it mean? What does the music you listen to mean? He's asking her questions. Now, the mother is looking at him because she doesn't like it. The younger daughter is in her own world. The 16-year-old is angry, and she's getting angrier at every question. And then she finally says, why do you need to understand it? Right? She kind of yells at him, at least by my standard. Why do you need to understand it? And he looks at his wife. And his wife looks back at him like, yes, excellent question. Why do you need to understand? That's the look on her face, like, The next scene, he has picked her up from what you find is an arrest, right? Because apparently she's having sex with two boys in the back of a car. Now, what he does to those two boys is interesting as hell. It's a father's dream. He basically puts on some gloves and opens the jail cell they're in, and he's alone with them. And he basically says, I'm gonna let y'all go, but you're gonna catch this ass whooping first. And he beats the crap out of both of them. That's the father's dream. But anyway, back to the scene. When he brings his daughter home, who has just been caught having sex with two, because the boys are over 18. So this is a statutory situation. They're running a threesome. They're running a train on her. He brings her home. And he starts to, he makes her explain to her mother what she was doing. The mother, of course, is taken aback and all kinds of, oh my God, what's going on? And the daughter starts to speak out, and she starts to talk shit, and he smacks her. And of course, they both, the daughter and the mother, oh my God, he smacked her. She ran into a room, locked the door, and the mother gets mad at the father. And I think it's as she's running to her room, the father says, oh, I think he was talking to the mother. He says, is this one of those things I'm not supposed to understand? Mother doesn't say anything. Now, I tell you that just to simply point out the dynamics in terms of parenting, right? His demonstration of care wasn't seen as care. It was seen as oppressive. And even though he's white and it's a white family, much of what he did, I didn't have a problem with, right? The mother had a problem with because it infringed on her daughter's freedom, which she didn't like once she found out her daughter was having sex. She didn't have a response to, so she left it to him to respond, and then she didn't like his response. But you tell me what you're going to do when your 16-year-old daughter is getting trains run on her. What role does the father play in that? What role does the mother play? Right? What about the question of parenting prior to that? See, that's what Woody Harrelson's character was trying to raise. He was trying to parent an errant teenager who was starting to turn and act a fool, and he didn't have the support of his wife. Now, there were things going on with him and the wife that, impacted this, I'm sure, but just on a parenting level, certain things you got to put to the side, and both of you have to come together on this child. And the wife was not willing to do that. She was siding with her daughter in this kind of quasi-independent feminist kind of framework. And now her daughter has started to act out in ways she did not see coming, and she didn't have an answer for it. So going back to Reeves' statement about care versus provision, right? Often what I think men's care is, in the eyes of, you know, the state, in the eyes of feminist policy, is it's invisible. See, women interpret care differently. In many instances, just like in this show, care is interpreted as doing what women agree with in the moment, which is random as fuck, by the way, right? But that's the demonstration of care. You do something that makes them feel good, that aligns with what they already want to do. Pushing back is not considered care. Pushing back is considered oppressive. But part of how men protect and provide, so Reeves is talking about provisioning in terms of being breadwinning. But what he leaves out of this is protection. One of the father's traditional roles, a role many men still take very seriously to this day, is the protection of his family. But here's the thing. How do you protect somebody from themselves? How do you protect a child from themselves? A child that you're not supposed to discipline because she's female, right? How do you protect her from herself? Do you just sit back and let her do whatever she wants? Because that seems to be the prevailing idea. And if you do so with a smile and a hug, somehow that's caring. But if you come back with structure and boundaries, that's oppressive. Until the shit goes down. And then it becomes, why didn't you do anything? This is the problem. So even with Reeves, again, by starting out from this feminist standpoint, he's coming at the question of care from how women have framed the discussion. And he's fundamentally saying men have not been responsible for caring for children. And this is what's hurting the family, that women have had to take on he actually has a sentence that it kind of sums it up. He says, the economic reliance of women on men held women down, but it also propped men up. Now the props have gone and many men are falling, right? He has this one way of approaching things. And, you know, he says in this chapter, he's arguing four things. He says the first thing is the male role has long been culturally defined as that of provider and based on the economic dependence of mothers on men. That's his first point, right? That men are providers and women have to depend on them. Two, he says this traditional role has been dismantled by the securing of economic independence by women. I agree, that has taken place. Seeing far more women in the workplace. But what he's not talking about is how many women are starting to pull back from that and wishing they didn't have to be. See, it was all good, especially in the 80s, right? When you had jobs and people had incomes, and, you know, when everything's going good, it's all good. When shit starts to get tough, you start to see rampant unemployment. Women's jobs are starting to be replaced by AI. Now, all of a sudden, you have people who are calling for more traditional relationships again. Although I would say that they have a faulty definition of it. Their definition of what a traditional relationship is I want, and they'll say this, I want to get back to a traditional relationship because I'm tired of working. I'm tired of doing for myself. I don't want to shovel snow in my yard again. I don't want to take the trash out. I don't want to have to be responsible for the bills. I don't want to have to make any more decisions. Child, I want a man to come in and do all of that. And when you ask them, well, what is it that you do in that? Well, I just stay home. He works. He takes care of everything. I just stay home. But see, understand, housewives know that's not what that dynamic is. Kevin even tried to explain that to him. Staying at home is work, especially if you have kids. You're not just staying at home. You're replacing all the institutions that people have to bring into their family to replace you. In other words, my wife definitely and I, we went through this. When she's working, of course, you got to get childcare, but you don't know what the hell this person is teaching your kid. You don't know what's going on with them. You don't know what impact. Look, I mean, one of the first places that we had watch my son when she went back to work after 6 months, they had him in what are those called? A playpen, and they had it turned to the television set, and he was watching hours and hours of what's that white Christian channel? I don't remember the name of it, but I can't remember the name. It was like a white Christian channel, and they all had, there was just sermons all day by old white men. She never once even asked us what our religious view was. Was it TBN? It might have been, Kevin. Or I don't remember the name of the network, but that's all it was all day, was just sermons from white churches. And she never even bothered to ask us what our religious orientation was, right? So again, when you start talking about daycare, you're looking at other people, strange people outside of your family that are now supervising your child and teaching your child. And that for a child is easy to do. You don't even have to do anything. You teach a child by not doing anything. If you don't love a child, if you don't love on a child, if you don't support a child, you teach a child that they're not worthy of being loved, believe it or not. They get lessons whether something happens to them or whether it doesn't. But if she's outside the home and you're the primary breadwinner, but she's still outside of it, you have to rely on other institutions to supplement that. But if you do decide to go back into a traditional arrangement, if you have a woman that wants to play that role, a lot of people don't understand today what it used to entail. We transfer the values of the family onto the child by being present to the child while the breadwinner earns. And even in the Black community, men still make more. But also, there's a certain capacity to deal with stress that one could argue men are socialized to expect. And we can get into arguments about whether we're physically capable of dealing with it too, but all of that is, there are questions back and forth on that, right? Because Black men have to deal with an undue amount of stress that may contribute to our lowered life expectancy too. So there is that. But the point I'm getting at here is now we have this return to the traditional, but the definition of the traditional is rooted in what makes her feel good. And it's not rooted in what is actually best for the child, which is what the traditional relationship was about when it came to marriage. Reeves is making the same kinds of judgments and mistakes in his framing of the issue as what I hear from contemporary women and feminists who might even those who want to go back to what they consider the traditional, but it's not really traditional. It really isn't. It's actually something that hasn't really existed before. It's this kind of serving the queen dynamic, right? Where she sits at home, with her feet kicked up, and not only do you provide, but you also have to pay institutions to to compensate for what she's not doing, right? So anyway, because most of these women don't talk about, well, I'm going to cook, and understand something. Cooking is important too. It's not. I think the way it kind of happens in casual conversation in social media is when you talk about women cooking while men work, even when women want men to work so they can stay home, it's considered slavery, particularly in the Black community, right? But when you look at, say, I remember when I started to see the rise of the MGT and the Nation of Islam, one of the things I noticed about how those women were trained was that cooking was you providing security and health in a chemically, a chemically poisonous environment as far as food. Most of us live in food deserts. You know what that is? Right? Like when you look at white communities, there are a certain number of grocery stores available per every 10,000 people. In the Black community, it's far less. So Black and brown communities. So we find ourselves going to fewer grocery stores, having fewer grocery stores available. And then, of course, the quality of the food is much lower, even though the price is considerably high for lower quality food with fewer stores. So you have a lot of people living off of liquor store food and so on and so forth. Cooking, in many ways, has always been about providing security and health for a family. How that became, well, this is slavery, is ridiculous. So in this call for some women who want to go back to the traditional, cooking is still considered slavery. Cleaning is still considered servile. So I know people who have still had to hire a maid and still have to buy fast food every night for women who wanted to stay home and let him provide. We have a skewed view of what is traditional, right? So I laid out two of the things that in this chapter that Reeves says he wants to kind of frame. So the first one was that men were considered breadwinners with women being dependent. And then the traditional role was dismantled because of economic independence for women. And then the third one is culture and policy are stuck on an obsolete model of fatherhood, lagging way behind economic reality. Well, again, as long as you let women define how they perceive men, then you'd be right. It's always interesting to me when I hear women tell men what they do and why they're doing it. And 95% of the time they're wrong. And I'm even talking about this in terms of individual conversations. I've had women tell me, "Oh, this is what you do and this is why you do it." One, you never even asked me what I'm doing. You're assuming what I'm doing based on what you see. You damn sure don't ask me why I'm doing it. And I found this to be the case for a lot of men, not just me. Shout out to Andre. He says, facts, having to work outside and inside of the home, if not outsourcing, is pointless. Yeah. Can be. Yeah. You have to be on the same team. But a lot of men aren't even playing that, because what they're finding is that this new soft life, I want to live at home dynamic is a trap in and of itself. One, because the idea of the traditional is usually faulty, but two, because once you start to provide this lifestyle, what happens when you get divorced? If you have two people making an income and you get divorced, right? Child support, custody, those things tend to happen regardless. But what happens when she's not working at all? I know things differ from state to state, but by and large, men are finding themselves more on the hook. Hell, alimony was going down from the 80s onward. But what starts to happen if you have this mass movement back to the traditional, but women are still divorcing at an 80% clip, initiating divorce, right? At damn near 80% of the time. What tends to happen? Men find themselves having to pay more after a divorce because she's not working. So so if you got to decide, if you do want the traditional, you got to take the risk of paying more if she divorces you. But if you do the 50-50 thing, you definitely deal with a lack of respect. And of course, the kids suffer because you have to depend on outside institutions to compensate. So it's you got to choose. And that, of course, depends on your capacity to vet the person standing in front of you. And sometimes that shit just doesn't work. Sometimes you just get a bad hand, because the people we are when we get married is never the people we are when we get a divorce. And to the extent that we are, a lot of that shit, even after 2 years of just dating and looking at her and paying attention, sometimes it just doesn't prepare you. It just doesn't. At some point, it's just the roll of the dice. But at the very least, you can make sure that if you're going to do traditional, you have an understanding, and she has an understanding, an agreement, and a contract of what traditional actually means. Make sure she understands what that means. Make sure she understands what you expect, and vice versa. And if you can't come to an agreement, that may not be the person you need to marry, right? But at the very least, when you look at the scholars who are approaching this subject, what they're doing is they're supporting this kind of misunderstanding of the traditional to suit women's sensibilities and ignore men's. And so they're trying to push you into supporting it, even with this new kind of approach to the traditional, or accepting this definition of what women want marriage to be, right? Where they're looking for men to demonstrate care the way they demonstrate care, and not necessarily care based on how men demonstrate care, right? So the third one, as I said, that he brings up is culture and policy are stuck on an obsolete model of fatherhood, lagging way behind economic reality. So basically, he's saying since the 1970s, when the dollar bill topped out, even amongst white families, two incomes became the norm because it had to be. Well, okay. To the extent that that has to be the case, we still can't have a faulty definition of fatherhood based on feminist slandering of men. Because if the foundational ideology is that men are lesser beings and they're problematic and they're oppressive, then how are you going to define fatherhood? In what way will it be an actual reflection of what I do and who I am versus what you portray me to be as it suits your politics, right? So that's already going to be a problem. The last one, point number 4, he brings up is this is resulting in a dad deficit, he calls it, with men increasingly unable to fulfill the traditional breadwinner role, but yet to step into a new one. The only problem here is that their definition of a new one is solely defined by women's interests. Men have no say. And that's part of the problem with this, right? It's part of the problem. Because what it leaves us is in a position of catering to an agenda that does not see us as human beings and does not regard our contributions historically or contemporarily as relevant, unless it reflects their contributions or their sensibilities. I can tell you on many an occasion, whether it was a girlfriend or sometimes my wife, They did not understand what I was doing with my son till much later. There were things that I would do sometimes that they just did not understand. I remember, I'll be brief on this because I don't want to embarrass my son, but I do remember about a year and a half ago or so, I went on a date and I took my son to, it was the date, and my son and myself, I took them, we all went to the movies. And we drove separate cars because I wanted my son to practice. He hadn't gotten his license yet, and he was dragging his feet. But he later told me he was dragging his feet because he was scared to drive. He was scared to get into an accident and cost me money. But the point was he was afraid to drive. So so I made him drive by himself. We got to the movies, and he kept parking wrong in the parking stalls. He was split over 2 different stalls. So I made him keep reparking 3 or 4 times until he got it right. And the lady I was with, who also was a mother, so it's not like she didn't have kids at all, she thought I was being harsh. She kept trying to say, well, maybe you should just, no, I got this. Excuse me. What she perceived as being too hard on him was me understanding that the next time he has to park, I'm not going to be there. And if he can't learn how to do this when I'm standing here, it might cause a problem later. Right? So I stood there and I made him do it until he finally got it. And he was mad at me. He didn't want to say anything. She was mad at me because she felt like I was being too hard. So the whole, the evening was kind of awkward. But then guess what? A couple months later, my son gets his license and he's driving with confidence. Right? And she even called me at one point to say, you know what? That was good business. I see now what you were doing. Now, this is happening across the board for men, right? And even Reeves is participating in this. If you don't understand what I'm doing and why, and you're going to frame it as either a deficit or a faulty parenting method because it doesn't reflect how women parent, we can't have an honest conversation about what the state of the family actually is. And one of the things I can also tell you is that Black men in particular have started withdrawing from marriage since the 1960s. What feminists defined that to be was deadbeat dad syndrome. And I'm not saying that doesn't exist, but I'm saying there are other things that exist too that women won't cop to, like their capacity to push men out of the family using institutions, be they, courts or police officers, right? And pressuring men to accept situations they may not agree with, which leaves men with few opportunities. So some leave. And I've had those men start new families and talk to me about it. And the kids from their previous family who they're only allowed to see on their wife's behest, sometimes they've had to wait until those kids grow up and come talk to them as adults. And then they can share with them, this is why I left, this is what happened, and this is why I had to start a new family. It's a hard conversation to have. It's a hard experience to understand, especially if you're the child in that dynamic. And the father isn't always right for leaving. The mother isn't always, right in the dynamic. But at the end of the day, men leaving for good reason is never discussed publicly. It's always, especially in the Black community, the deadbeat dad syndrome. That's the only way it's interpreted. But there are too many men that have stories about women pushing them out of families using institutions, using proxy power. And that never comes up. It's just dismissed as deadbeat dad. The other part of it, too, is that some men, I've argued, have protested silently the concept of marriage in the Black community because of how these institutions are able to influence her behavior and how she's able to use them at whim. So you have some men that are leaving after the fact and some men that are leaving before they even get married. And don't underestimate the impact of birth control in this dynamic, too. Because women got all kinds of different types of birth control. Men are still dealing with rubbers. Like I said before, women are using nuclear power. We're still rubbing sticks for fire when it comes to the birth control. And once women got a certain capacity, especially in regard to the pill, this changed the family dynamic. And it meant that for men, she could determine the next 18 years of your life based on what could have been a 30-second exchange of fluids, if you will. Right? That gave women carte blanche power over a man's life. And then especially prior to the era of being able to get a DNA test on whether or not a child was yours, you had to hope she was telling the truth because you didn't have anything else to go on. Right? That's a lot of power to give one demographic in a community over the rest of the entire community. And then punish the men that don't want to play the game. See, if you're going to fix the culture, you're going to fix the family, you got to fix the policy, and it's not going to be quick. Because we also have a culture that complements that policy. A culture that tells women that they are in sole control of the family, that tells women they're in sole control of birth control, and the only control you have is whether or not you have sex. Now, you can definitely wear protection, but there's no guarantee on any of that. She fundamentally has far more control over that than you. Her birth control, she can use before, during, and after the act. And if she decides she wants to, there's a mistake involved and she wants to have it, you don't have much to say. So at the end of the day, we have to really take seriously what the situation going on with the family. Let me see. Missed a couple of super chats and I'm going to get back to the book. Let me see. I missed this. Shout out to Black Nerd Talks. Hope you good. He said that she's out of his league and he's barely lucky to have / get her usual dynamics of male and female relationships, especially in the Black community. Yeah. J Block says misandry toward King. I think I did mention that. Let's see. Shout out to Dante Bryant. He says, thank you. Thank you for listening, bro. Okay, let me see. Red Falls Black. We appreciate the super chat. Says standpoint theory strikes again. All right. Jail Block again says redefining fatherhood leads to no family. Indeed. Andre, shout out to you. Okay. Says they aren't going to release a proper male BC pill. Yeah. That should have happened a long time ago. Right. But this is where we are. So you've had men that have withdrawn from marriage as a form of protest, particularly Black men. You've had some men who were pushed out of the family, which we don't want to talk about, right? And then you have some that just had no respect for family. And even in that definition, even in that group of men who don't necessarily appreciate a family dynamic, some of them don't know how. They've never seen one, right? And then you have others that women know are not ready for family. Oh man, I saw a couple of different shows show this clip that I saw on TikTok, and I know some of y'all have seen it. And it's a woman who's pointing out a lot of these guys that women were having kids with, and she said she just kept putting up clip after clip. Right, these guys are sagging, and they're holding guns, and they're just in and out of trouble. And she's like, "What about this?" Said active dad to you. And what she was calling for was that women actually needed to take responsibility for who they were actually having children with. Because the deadbeat dad narrative was so common that we just blame men. And she was like, yeah, but if you use any kind of discernment, there's nothing about a lot of these dudes that y'all are having babies by that suggested that he was in any place to be a father. But here's the other part. There are some men who tell women in advance they don't want to be fathers. They're letting them know up front. And yet, I've seen too many a situation where after a couple years of being that designated hitter that she calls at 10 at night, or, being, just a friend with benefits over time, get comfortable, then all of a sudden her birth control just doesn't work. Scientific miracle, just stops working. And all of a sudden she's pregnant. And now he's at fault because he's not a good father. But he told you didn't want to be a father. You guys had an agreement on not having children. You practiced the birth control you agreed upon, but she changed her mind. But the discussion is never about how she changed her mind. The discussion is strictly about the fact that he had sex with her. Therefore, he's responsible for whatever decision she makes to impact the next 18 years of his life at least. And then the question becomes, not only does he pay on a regular basis, does he provide emotional support to a situation that he told you in advance he didn't want to do? But see, we can't have all those nuanced conversation about men, because that would suggest that men were human beings that had different approaches to family formation than women in a given situation. sometimes approaches that are not politically correct. Sometimes they're not, they don't, and politically correct in this circumstance just means you do shit that women want. I mean, let's boil it the fuck down. That's really all it is. And it becomes a problem. But it becomes his problem, not hers. And the courts will usually operate on her behalf in that regard, which leaves men, again, in a circumstance where this is what they're responding to. Shout out to Blackout. Appreciate the support. This is what we're looking at. So let me see. So those are the 4 areas that he said we're dealing with right now. He said there's a dad deficit, with men increasingly unable to fulfill the traditional breadwinner role, but yet to step into a new one. Right? There's a section in here talking about dads as providers. Right? I didn't want to go through this one necessarily at the moment. Let's see. He has a section here. This is only like a 12-page chapter or whatnot. So it's really short. But he has a section called Bicycles in a World of Fish. Right? It says Arena Dunn's statement that a woman needs a man like a fish needs a bicycle, later popularized by Gloria Steinem, was a memorable rallying cry of the women's movement. A little further away than I'd like. An evocative description of a world where women do not need men. Being able to support oneself allows one to choose a marriage out of love and not just economic dependence, Steinem said in 2004. Women are now the main breadwinner in 41% of U.S. households. Some of those are single mothers, but by no means all. 3 in 10 wives now out-earn their husbands, twice as many as in 1981. Most mothers now work full-time, and in almost half of families where both parents work full-time, mothers earn as much or more than fathers. Mothers have also received growing support from the welfare system, allowing even those with low or no earnings to be freer of the need for a breadwinning husband. Definitely true. And I've been saying that for years as well, right? So if you're dealing with poor women, you're dealing with access to welfare that men generally don't have. You're dealing with middle-class women, access to education. And I mean this over time. I'm not just talking about how many men and women are in school at this very moment. If you go back to the 1970s to now, you'll find that white men have fewer degrees than white women, but black men have about half as many degrees. And if you start talking about blue collar work, one of the things we talked about a few years ago on this channel with one of the, brothers who passed away, shout out to Force Windu, all respect due to the brother, committed suicide, right? An electrician, and had a chance when he passed to talk to his wife about, his experience, the family, the children they had, and whatnot. And one of the things he talked about was the difficulty of blue collar work, right? As an electrician, he said when he was getting trained, it was all good. I think he was being trained by a white man working under him. But when he actually stepped out, finished his certification, stepped out on his own, started his own company, he said that's when the rubber hit the surface. He said in the town he was living in, people didn't want to support a black electrician business. So he talked about all the different things that, or she told me, all the different things he had to do to compensate for that. And I only bring that up to say that often I'll hear discussions where people say, well, we don't need college degrees anymore. Everything just needs to be blue collar. And I'm like, don't get it twisted. There's no area where you can really escape. Now, there are certain industries that are easier than others. There are certain time periods where some of us could get through the fence more so than others. There's always that on an individual level. But what I'm saying is there's a challenge no matter what you choose to do, especially for black men. There's no easy route anywhere. And if it is easy, that's only for a window of time until too many people clog it up. And then we look for the next easy. Doesn't always work that way. So you're doing construction work, you're doing electrician work, you're going to the military. All of those things have nothing but respect for me. And I think they're viable options, as are many different tracks in terms of labor, particularly for men to get into. But there's always something. There's always something. Right? Whether you're dealing with what's it called? Oh man, what is that called? That was the word escaping me. My memory. That's right. Whether you're dealing with nepotism, right? Where you'll have many of these guys in construction or whatever, these white guys who are usually in management, they'll hire their family over you, or whether you're dealing with, you know, the kind of subtle racism that may impact your capacity, even if you have your own business. All of this shit, it's a challenge that doesn't go anywhere. Let me see. Shout out to Passport. Says you are right. You are the right voice for these times. These days, men need to be reminded that we are more than shut up and provide. Appreciate that, Passport. Y'all support the Passport OG channel. All right. Check the brother out. Doing some fabulous work over there. Yeah. And if you're interested in traveling internationally, that's definitely one of the brothers you want to get some advice from in terms of how to navigate it. So hopefully that transition from newbie to seasoned traveler is not as difficult for you as a lot of, you know, brothers that came before. They had to go through it the hard way to learn the ins and outs. And if that's something you want to do, you might want to get some advice from those brothers so you don't have to have it as hard. We can cut that learning curve. Anyway. So let me continue with this here. She says, women, welfare system. There we go. As the British politician and scholar David Willits writes in his book, The Pinch, a welfare system that was originally designed to compensate men for loss of earnings is slowly and messily redesigned to compensate women for the loss of men. I'll give him that one. That's a powerful quote. That's a powerful quote. I'm going to reread it. A welfare system that was originally designed to compensate men for loss of earnings is slowly and messily redesigned to compensate men for a loss of, to compensate women for the loss of men. That's deep. That's deep. Anyway, he says a more positive way to make the same point is that governments increasingly see their role as supporting women raising children, in part so that they are not trapped in a dependent relationship with a man. They just become dependent on government. But anyway, at the same time, there's been a liberalization of divorce law with the rise of no fault or a unilateral divorce that allow either party to end a marriage on any grounds. These laws remain the subject of heated debate, but they are clearly here to stay. Marriage and motherhood are no longer virtually synonymous. About 40% of births in the U.S. now take place outside marriage, up from 11% in 1970. A particularly striking trend is the decline in shotgun marriages. Half a century ago, pregnancies outside of marriage were common, but the couple went to the registry office or church before the maternity ward. No longer. In fact, the decline in shotgun marriages is the biggest single cause of the rise in non-marital births to first-time mothers since 1960, according to research from the Joint Economic Committee. Right, the greatest change has occurred at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder. In 1977, 26% of pregnancies among women with low levels of education resulted in a marriage before the birth. By 2007, the figure was just 2%. Right. So when you talk about the shotgun marriage, right, you're basically talking about a father or a family who is pressuring the young man who is assumed to have impregnated a young woman to marry her, right, before the child is born. Of course, now with abortion and, you know, resources that are extended to women in various ways, again, what he's pointing out is there's been a dramatic change, and now that's no longer a necessity because women can function without husbands, all in the spirit of trying to prevent her from having to become economically dependent on a husband. So, you know, there's a little bit of disingenuousness coming from some of this because what he's not doing is actually paying attention to what women are saying, right? And again, there's a tension between what feminists are calling for and what women are saying. Fundamentally, the feminists don't like women because women fuck it up. Women do not operate strictly by the plan that feminists would like. Now, on our end of things, they seem to do so far more than we would like. But feminists themselves are not happy with the degree to which women veer from the path outlaid for them because women still want to be with men. Women often still want to have children. And there are many women that still want to get married. This is not necessarily what feminists themselves like because they're trying to advance policy that requires that women behave in this newfangled way, right? But too many women still want to partner with men in a variety of different ways. And that in and of itself still produces problems for feminists. So they often don't like what women want to do. I mean, think of it this way. The Barbie movie that came out a few months ago blew it up. You know, everybody was watching Barbie. All these women went to go see it. And they made it this, you know, they tried to make it this feminist uplift. But you had a lot of feminists that are like, I don't want a damn movie about Barbie. I mean, you know, housewife, what is it, housewife TV series, women that are into clothes and fashion, some of that stuff really does kind of veer, depending on the kind of feminism we're talking about and the time period it came out of. Some of it radically veers from what feminism has espoused at different points in time. So I don't want to present women's behavior as the seamless stream with contemporary feminism. There are radical breaks that have happened all throughout. Some that were potentially positive, some that were wiped away, all those kind of things. But the point I'm getting at simply here is that, this whole push to, dissect men and women apart so women didn't have to economically depend on men has come with its own cost. It's required a dependence on government, for one thing, but it also has incurred men's withdrawal, boys' withdrawal. And they're not understanding it. That's one of the things I read in Reeves last week. He even says it. We don't understand why men are withdrawing. He says we don't get it. I have proposed a thesis in my book and throughout my show where I'm saying, no, there's a reason. And you can actually point to it. Actually, there are multiple reasons. There's not one reason, but some are more significant than others. And one of the things I'll say about Reeves in this book is that I think he dramatically either underestimates the importance of media or has withdrawn from talking about it for whatever reason. But either way, he severely ignores media in terms of another form of programming. So you have courts, you have policies around women's vulnerability, you have police officers that can be called in to enforce, even under false pretenses, a woman's will. You have all these things that are in place to allow women the mobility to reshape their identity over the last half century. What you also have is media. And media comes in and gives women an image of what it means to be independent, an image of what it means to be successful, and so on and so forth. And people like Reeves dramatically underestimate the impact of that image, the image that they've been shown for generations. And that's separate from what women pass down to each other in families. If you grew up as a young man in a family full of women, and you've ever sat in on some of those war councils where your little sister is sitting there learning from older women who are pissed off and giving each other tips on how to kick men in the nuts, politically speaking, economically speaking, judicially speaking, those behaviors that are passed down shape behavior as well. Younger women are inheriting certain practices that didn't exist in their grandmother's time period, right? But they're inheriting these things from these older women who are trying to pass down these tips and methods for being more and more independent from men, not understanding what it's actually doing, not only to men in the community, but sometimes to their own boys, right? So you have that. But again, you have media, and media is shaping behavior, it's shaping options. And many of these women or many of these scholars like Reeves are oblivious to this. And I think you can't ignore such a multi-billion-dollar industry that is all about programming. I mean, they fucking tell you that in the term, media programming. This is what it is. And on a gendered scale, what have we actually seen in the last 10 years alone, right? I posted something on Facebook and Twitter earlier today, and it was in response to a video. Hold on. There we go. So it was in response to this video here. This is from Midnight's Edge, and it says, how Disney was conquered. And what it deals with is the impact of DEI and DEI culture in media. And one of the things they talk about, they've been on the cutting edge of this whole question of ESG, DEIs, and this discussion about how this has changed and impacted Disney's programming. And of course, that encompasses Marvel, superhero movies. It's much bigger than Disney, but Disney is an excellent test case to use to look at this, right? And so this is what he's talking about, what they are talking about. Midnight's Edge, I think it is. So what they start talking about is how within Disney itself, the way DEI culture kind of came up was they started to push out people on the basis of, there not being enough diversity, right? So they started hiring people. He said, but the fundamental problem is you didn't have enough people. Right. And so he starts to point out projects that were so particular. I forget the name of the movie because I never saw it, but it was a cartoon. It was for Asian. It was like, I think it was for Asians. And so the question became for Disney at that point, how many Asians can we bring in to help create this cartoon? So we got to get rid of these white boys and bring in more Asians. But he said the fundamental problem is there wasn't enough. So, you know, if you're dealing with film with Native Americans or Black folk, he was saying there were not enough people who were really certified to work in this capacity. He said, but what they did instead is they brought in people who had minimal certification or sometimes none, and they kind of jammed them in there. And he said, and what this did is cut the quality of a lot of the media programming, which of course meant that in terms of sales, that went down. Now, in terms of ESG, they probably got a good fair share of grant money in terms of being able to say that their project was diverse, but audiences started to balk and withdraw, right, and pull back. And so now you have a company like Disney that's lost billions over this, right? And then, of course, it started to impact the administration. And so a lot of this came down to intersectionality, right? And intersectionality creates this hierarchy of oppression and determines who is most oppressed. And therefore, if you're going to operate in this, question on diversity and equity and inclusion, then those who are most oppressed in the dynamic should be able to take higher position and so on and so forth. Interestingly, what I started to point out was how this DEI culture impacts Black men, because I argue that, we didn't really get to benefit. So one of the things I wrote this kind of longer section, and let's see, I'll read it to you. So I said, so I posted this video on both Twitter and Facebook, and I accompanied it with my comments. I said, as Black men, as Black men were under assault, we are under assault by DEI culture. This is part of the Venn diagram where many of us subtly agree with a lot of the white conservative pushback against it. So we're indifferent about its crash and burn, as not only did few of us benefit from it, we were perceived as honorary white men by its ideology of men bad, women divine. But as many of us have few other alignments with white conservatism, we tend to not be as loud. This approach is becoming more the case in politics as well. As Democrats and liberals subsume Black men's voting options under Black women's, the community is perceived as a voting monolith, which is statistically true but slowly dissipating. Thus, Democratic policy ignores Black men who are observing both Black women's identitarian independence from us and electoral politics, culture, and policy of ignoring us, kind of like affirmative action in the 80s that served white women and saw Black women as double minorities, but ignored Black men. Right? That said, we tend to silently watch this DEI culture burn with indifference. Then, every 4 years, presidential candidates only approach us, the most voter disenfranchised group, for the optics, while underestimating how much we are finding ourselves independent from everyone. And here's the thing: you don't want large populations of men who find themselves disassociated from everything. As the Joker once said, everything burns, right? So what I'm merely saying here, as we're talking about this, is the same thing we're seeing in regard to how DEI has treated Black men. And if you don't understand what I mean, I'm not necessarily talking about DEI in terms of hiring for formal positions, even though the majority of what I've seen has tended to go to women and LGBTs more so than straight men in DEI culture. But I would say also, if you look at what the media has produced, which reflects this DEI culture. And when it comes to Black men, there's only 2 instances in regard to this whole Disney thing that give us great example as to how straight Black men are perceived. You either have the sidekick dynamic of the superhero genre, where we're sidekicks to white men, or you have the Black Panther issue. Even from the first movie, they kept foregrounding women that were either not in the original comic series or were introduced very late to the lore, right? Characters that didn't come about till the 2000s versus characters that were designed in the 60s. And not only did they foreground those characters over T'Challa, the Black Panther, they gave his powers to them as well. And from the first to the second movie, they continued to foreground these other characters who were mostly women and LGBT over T'Challa, because again, he's a straight Black male or African male, depending on where you want to take the lore. Technically, he's designed in an African American context, in a Western context, but they're imagining African features, African qualities, so on and so forth. So there you have. But the fact is, he's a straight Black male, visibly speaking, in terms of optics. So he had to be foregrounded by women and LGBT groups. And then when Chadwick Boseman died, they used it as an advantage to not even bring the goddamn character back. Right? This is how Black men, straight Black men, are seen in DEI culture. And immediately I had people questioning whether or not that's true. I don't know. Is there proof that DEI culture? I said, did you watch any of the movies? That should tell you how we're perceived, right? But what I'm also saying is that the same thing that's happening in the DEI context is also happening in politics. And Black men are finding themselves ignored. And what some are doing is either withdrawing or pushing for non-traditional politics from non-traditional sources. I'm an independent. I'm not on the right or the left. But when I was on the left. But even then, I was more, third party option. Now I'm an independent. For me, it's functional. Who's going to meet our needs? Who's going to meet our demands? And if nobody is, I withdraw. And I don't lose any sleep about it. And I think a lot of Black men are starting to take this, and it's being dismissed as conservative. It's being dismissed as, oh, you just love Trump. No, you got a lot of brothers that are pulling out altogether. But this is all dealing with media, which I'm saying that Reeves is ignoring. There's a whole nother war being fought, a whole nother set of influences that impact this gender issue tremendously, so that I think Reeves drastically underestimates by ignoring it and not giving it its due in this book of Boys and Men. Because whether we're talking about what happens on the screen or whether we're talking about the politics behind it, whether, again, going back to the whole question of DEI and ESG, all of this needs to be brought into this discussion because it also contributes to shaping our behavior and our perception of how our community is supposed to function, how the world is supposed to work, how the country is supposed to work. And if you're going to only approach this from a feminist standpoint with an apologetics at hoping that feminists will have empathy for men, but you're not really going to address what men are actually saying or experiencing, then I take this politically correct manosphere to be as limp dick as anybody with ED. Anyway, I think I'll end it there tonight. We're a little over 2 hours. I am interested to see what you guys think. What did I miss? Sometimes hopping from subject to subject, I may have missed something, left something on the table that I shouldn't have. To any extent that I missed something, I apologize. But I am interested to hear more about what you think, more about what your thoughts are, especially if you've read Reeves. And if you have a section that you want me to cover that I didn't, let me know. Let me know. But at the end of the day, I want to hear your thoughts about anything I've covered tonight. Let's get the conversation going. Please feel free to share stories about things that are reflective of what we've talked about and, get us thinking. Because how many spaces can Black men get together and have conversations independent of worrying about what other people might say or do to us for not agreeing with them, right? One of the reasons brothers in this space is so anonymous. They can't afford to lose their jobs because somebody doesn't like the fact that they think something different than they do. So let's take advantage of the fact that we have one of those spaces and let's share ideas about what we think. Right? Shout out to Cameron Shabazz. Appreciate the donation there. Says thank you for the work, good brother. Appreciate you listening. Right? Thank you for that. I am going to go figure out what to jump into tonight and whatnot. Shout out to Marcus Taylor for the support. All right. Appreciate that. And again, I look forward to hearing what you guys think. That said, y'all have a good night. Talk to y'all soon. Peace. Uh-oh. There we go. There we go. Where'd it go? We are not criminals by birth, perennial rapists, incapable intellects, man-children, sperm donors, child support well springs, success objects, walking phalluses, ATM machines, lottery tickets, unintelligent henchmen, valueless assassins, pro bono mercenaries, unpaid bodyguards, interchangeable stepfathers, child discipline proxies, unpaid repairmen, workhorses, emotional tampons, or any other socially accepted dehumanizing stereotype. We are thinkers, inventors, innovators, leaders, fathers, and men. Embrace your humanity, know your worth, and extend your time, attention, and resources only to those who genuinely respect you. And remember, your worth is not defined by meeting other people's narcissistic, selfish, and unrealistic needs. You define your worth. Peace.